Hi, my name's Dave Goulson. I'm a Professor of Biology at the University of Sussex, and I'd like to talk to you today about the thrilling subject of neonicotinoids. I've been embroiled in the controversy surrounding this group of insecticides for about nearly 15 years now, God help me. And there's a lot going on at the moment. There's two parallel stories. One about flea treatments on dogs and cats, and the other one a long-running saga about their use in farming, and particularly these days on sugar beet. And I thought it might be helpful for those of you that really want to know to try and kind of explain the situation, give you some background on these chemicals and what I think the way forward is. So let me start off by introducing what these chemicals are. Neonicotinoids are a family of insecticides that were introduced to farming in about the mid-1990s, so quite a long time ago now, 30 years ago. They're synthetic kind of variants, lab creations, versions of nicotine, hence the name. They're neurotoxins. They're extremely toxic to insect life, which is arguably what you want in an insecticide. So I've mentioned they're neurotoxins. They attack the nervous system of the insect. So they're kind of like sarin gas or Novichok for insects. Sufficient doses, the exposure causes paralysis and death. But at lower doses than that, because they're attacking the nervous system, it causes bees, for example, to become unable to navigate and less able to learn which flowers to visit. It can also do things like impair the immune system of the insect and reduce their fertility and so on. The dose required to kill an insect is very small. I mentioned they're really toxic. So we normally measure how toxic something is by a thing called an LD50, the lethal dose that kills 50%, half of your test animals. And so, for example, the LD50 for most of these neonicotinoids in the honeybee is just under 4 billionths of a gram, which is kind of hard to visualize. But that means that 1 teaspoon of these chemicals would be enough to give an LD50 dose to 1.25 billion honeybees. So they're potentially pretty potent chemicals. I should also, while I'm at it, briefly introduce fipronil, which is not a neonicotinoid, but it's very similar. It's also a nerve agent. It's also toxic in tiny quantities. It's been around for roughly the same amount of time, and it's used in similar ways by farmers. So for all practical purposes, it's probably we can regard it as another neonicotinoid, or near enough. Okay. So when these chemicals were introduced, they were mainly being used as seed dressings. So the farmer would buy his crop seeds pre-coated with the insecticide on the outside of the seed, and the idea is, it's a pretty cool idea, very simple. It's the farmer just sows the seed in the ground. These chemicals are water soluble, so they dissolve in the damp soil, in the soil moisture. And then as the little seed germinates, its roots suck up some of the pesticide, and they're systemic, and this is an important point. So they spread to all parts of the growing crop and protect it against insect herbivores, which is what the farmer is after. But there's an obvious problem here if the crop flowers. So for example, sunflowers, if the chemical spreads to all parts of the plant, that includes the pollen and the nectar. And if your crop is reliant on bees or other pollinating insects to pollinate it, then that fairly obviously poses a risk to the pollinators. And So very soon after these chemicals were introduced in the 90s, French beekeepers were the first people to notice that if they put their hives near sunflower fields, that they tended to die. And they connected that to this new generation of insecticides that farmers were using, and started campaigning against their use. For a long time, the French beekeepers were largely ignored. They didn't get much traction, but slowly evidence began to accumulate from scientific studies that maybe they were onto something. Now, I came into this in the late noughties. At the time, very little work had been done on bumblebees, and bumblebees are my speciality. So we decided to study whether bumblebee nests exposed to a field of oilseed rape, which is the most commonly grown flowering crop in the United Kingdom, whether that was doing them any harm. So we simulated exposing bumblebee nests to the same concentrations of pollen and nectar, of pesticides in pollen and nectar, as they would receive if they fed on an oilseed rape crop. And we found that the nests did really poorly. Compared to control nests without pesticide, those treated with the pesticide, the nests grew much more slowly and produced way fewer, 85% fewer queens at the end of the summer, which is pretty catastrophic. And that, our study, along with lots of other, by this stage, studies on honeybees and other insects, together was sufficient evidence that the European Food Standards Agency recommended in 2013 that the European Union should ban neonicotinoids from use on flowering crops. And they did, which was hurrah. Those of us who'd been working on this were mighty pleased. It seemed to be a rare example of governments acting on scientific information, if only that were common. Anyway, so that's, you might have thought was story over, but far from it. So it then turned out that even though we'd banned the use of these chemicals on flowering crops, when we looked in the pollen and nectar of bumblebee nests and honeybee hives, they were still being exposed to neonicotinoids after the 2013 ban on their use on flowering crops. To understand how bees were still being poisoned, we need to look at the environmental fate of neonicotinoids when they're used as a seed dressing. So I explained that they dissolve in the soil moisture around the little seed, and then they're taken up by the seedling as it grows. And actually, only about 5% on average of the active ingredient of the insecticide is taken up by the crop. Most of it is going into the soil and the soil water, where they can last for years. They're quite persistent, these chemicals, so they can accumulate if a new treated crop is sown every year. And just as they're taken up by the roots of the crop, they can be taken up by any other plant with its roots in the same soil. So a follow-on crop will also be contaminated. And the hedgerow wildflowers, or wildflowers in the field margin next to a treated crop, if the soil's contaminated, the wildflowers will be contaminated. Even the trees growing in hedgerows will be contaminated. And also, it's become clear that the chemicals dissolved in the soil water leach downhill into ditches, which drain into streams and rivers and lakes and the sea and so on. So there's aquatic pollution resulting from this as well. So in fact, the whole farmed environment, the soils, the hedgerows, the streams, the ponds, all being contaminated with these potent neurotoxins. And bees continued to be exposed despite the ban on the use of these chemicals on flowering crops, because the wildflowers, the hedgerow plants growing in farmland, were also contaminated. And so my lab and others were busy studying this and presented the evidence, and thankfully the European Union were really good. They were on it, and in 2018 they introduced pretty much a blanket ban on all use of neonics, not just on flowering crops, but on non-flowering crops, because that was still contaminating the environment and causing bees to be poisoned, as well as a raft of other wildlife. Great. There's a slight fly in the ointment, which is that the European Union allowed derogations. They allowed individual governments within the EU to grant one-off exemptions to farmers for a particular crop if they could argue that their crop was likely to be wiped out by some kind of pest if they were not able to use neonics. This was an emergency use. And there were quite a few applications that were successful around Europe following the 2018 ban. But in 2023, Europe decided to do away with these derogations entirely. So from 2023 onwards, no farmer in the European Union has been allowed to use neonics in any way on their crops. Which brings me to the UK, because of course we're not part of the European Union anymore. And so our government can continue to grant derogations if it so wishes. And for the last 4 years, the sugar industry, led by British Sugar, the company that buys all sugar beet in the UK, have applied for an emergency derogation to use a neonicotinoid on sugar beet. The argument is that beet yellows virus, which is spread by aphids, would cause large sugar beet losses if they weren't allowed to use neonics, and the government, the previous Tory government, accepted this case and granted the derogations. Importantly, this was going against the advice of the experts, their own experts. So the Health and Safety Executive recommended that this application for a derogation be rejected. The government also has a committee, the Expert Committee on Pesticides, formed of scientists who are experts in this area. And they said that the government shouldn't grant this exemption, but they did anyway. Bless them. Now, the Labour Party, in the election campaign, said that they would not grant these derogations. There would be no more neonics under their watch. They didn't put it in the manifesto, and it now seems that they are considering the latest application. British Sugar have put in another application to use neonics on sugar beet. This would be the crop sown in early spring next year. That's currently being considered by the Labour government, and I really hope they don't grant it. Not only because the obvious risk to bees and the environment generally, we have an insect crisis, we have insects declining faster than they have done perhaps for 65 million years, along with the rest of biodiversity. The last thing we want to be doing is granting derogations to use nerve agents in farmland. But also, it's worth reflecting that sugar is really bad for us, so we're basically risking poisoning the environment so that we can poison ourselves with, all the evidence is that sugar is the main, excessive consumption of refined sugar is the main cause of obesity and diabetes in this country, which is then associated with a whole raft of other health conditions, which is costing the health service and the economy more broadly an estimated, if I remember correctly, £37 billion a year. Wow. So why would we want to prop up sugar production? Some people at this point would jump in and say, but hang on, if we don't grow the sugar ourselves, people will still want to consume it. We'll just have to import more sugar, and that means we're offshoring the environmental impact of its production. We're becoming more dependent on imports. Well, there's two answers to that. One would be to try and reduce the amount of sugar we're consuming so that we're all healthier, which could be done very simply by extending the sugar tax on fizzy drinks to sugary foods. The tax on fizzy drinks was pretty successful. Extending it to foods was recommended in the National Food Strategy document written by Henry Dimbleby, commissioned by Boris Johnson, but then totally ignored by Boris Johnson. So we could try and discourage sugar consumption. But also, the argument about increasing imports only makes sense if you assume that farmers who don't grow sugar beet are not going to grow anything else. In actual fact, sugar beet requires pretty good soil to grow. There's a whole raft of much healthier crops that could be grown on that land instead. And bear in mind that we import the majority of our fruits and vegetables, so encouraging farmers to grow a different crop if they can't grow sugar beet without neonics seems like the obvious solution, along with trying to reduce sugar consumption. Anyway, we'll await whether the Labour government agrees with me. Okay, so that's farming, that's agriculture and neonics. But there's a whole separate thread to this story, which is that while environmentalists and scientists have obsessed somewhat about the use of neonics in farming, the whole time many of us have been applying them to our family pets without realizing that these are the same chemicals that we're concerned about poisoning bees in farmland. So to tell the sort of story in full, after the 2018 ban on use of neonics in farming, river samples collected by the Environment Agency showed that one particular neonic, imidacloprid, and also fipronil that I mentioned earlier, were regularly turning up in rivers. And that seemed pretty odd, given that they'd been banned. But when people looked into it, they realised that actually there was this veterinary use of these chemicals, which no one had really paid any attention to. We'd all assumed, I think, that perhaps the amount used was trivial. But actually, vets recommend, or many vets recommend, prophylactic use of flea treatments on dogs and cats. And these flea treatments usually contain either imidacloprid or fipronil. You spot them onto the neck of the animal. And the dose you're supposed to put on a Labrador, for example, every month to protect it against fleas, that is 250 milligrams of imidacloprid. Just to go back to the whole LD50 toxicity argument, so the pesticide you're putting on your dog, that's enough to give an LD50 dose to 60 million honeybees, and you're adding that to your dog every month. If everyone's doing that to the about 22 million dogs and cats in the UK, then that starts to add up. And in fact, the evidence from sales figures we have is that sales of neonics to put on pets, or imidacloprid or fipronil, are in the order of several tons per year. They're a similar order of magnitude, slightly less than was used in farming, but not that much less. So how are they getting from pets into rivers? Well, the obvious route is via swimming. If dogs jump in a river, but it turns out there's another route. I've had a PhD student, Rose Perkins, who is herself a vet, but was funded by DEFRA to study the environmental fate of these flea treatments. And she found, when she looked at the Environment Agency river data, that contamination with of rivers with neonics was always much higher just below sewage treatment work outflows, which suggests it's not dogs swimming in the rivers, it's the neonics that are ending up going down the drain. And when she investigated this in more detail, she found that some of that is coming from people washing their dogs, giving them a shampoo, taking them to the poodle parlour or whatever, which obviously, if there's chemicals on the outside of the dog and you shampoo it, well, a lot of it's going to go down the drain. And it turns out these chemicals aren't removed by anything that happens at the sewage treatment works. They go out into the rivers. But it's not just washing the dog. If you wash the dog's bedding, it turns out the bedding is covered in these chemicals. If you stroke your dog, you get the chemical on your hands. And if you then wash your hands, they go down the drain. And people do that often several times a day. So there are a whole bunch of routes whereby the stuff that you put on the neck of your family pet can end up in a river not too far from you. And the concentrations found in rivers of both imidacloprid and fipronil frequently exceed what are deemed to be safe limits, safe for aquatic wildlife. often several-fold higher than the safe limit. So there's enough of these chemicals getting into our rivers to be doing them harm, and it's not like there isn't enough shit in our rivers already without adding a neurotoxin. It's also worth briefly mentioning that when you realise that these things are on our hands, if we're a dog or a cat owner, then you wonder whether that's actually particularly good for us to be chronically exposed via our family pet to neurotoxins. There's not been much study on the human health risks, but one study from Switzerland found they managed to get hold of 13 cerebrospinal fluid samples from children that were being treated for nothing to do with pesticides. But they analysed the cerebrospinal fluid, and all 13 of these kids had imidacloprid detectable in their cerebrospinal fluid, which is kind of worrying because that's the liquid that bathes their brain, and that's a neurotoxin. There's also a study on fipronil which showed that it readily crosses the placental barrier into unborn fetuses, and that exposure of those fetuses to fipronil impairs their development. So there's enough evidence to be at least somewhat concerned and think maybe it isn't a good idea to be putting this stuff on my family pet. I'm not a vet, I'm not the best person to decide what the way forward is, but I would argue very strongly that the status quo is not good enough. Perhaps these chemicals should be prescription only. That would be a step in the right direction. At the moment you can buy them straight off the shelf in your local supermarket. I think vets should not be recommending prophylactic use all year round. Even on animals that don't go outside, like house cats, that's just ridiculous. There's just no need. I think vets should be encouraging pet owners to practice things like regular hot washing of the animal's bedding, which is where fleas breed, as an alternative way of controlling their numbers, rather than relying on chemical means. But if you have to use chemical means, there are alternatives, things like tablet forms, like Bravecto, which are probably also have environmental risks that we don't fully understand, but may be better. That's something that I think DEFRA and the British Veterinary Association need to look into. But I think we need to do something. We can't carry on accidentally poisoning our rivers and filling our homes with neonics, if you ask me. Who knows what the way forward is, but I would ask British vets to give this some serious consideration. So there you have it. The neonic saga rumbles on and on. Just when you think it's over, it turns out it isn't. I should say, just to finish off, that it isn't all about banning things. If we ban neonics, they will just be replaced by something else. They have been in agriculture. The alternative flea treatments may turn out to be just as bad. I think we need to find ways to reduce pesticide use rather than always just looking to move on to the new pesticide, which usually turns out to be just as bad as the old pesticide. Anyway, that's probably enough rambling from me. I hope you didn't find that utterly boring. If you want to get updates on this and other related topics from me, then subscribe to my channel and have a lovely day.